We're stepping into the aftermath of the most catastrophic event in Earth's last 500 million years. The dinosaurs are gone. The sky is still choked with ash and sulfur, and the debris of a world that burned. And somewhere in the rubble, hiding in a root system, pressed against the cold soil, breathing carefully, a small, trembling creature the size of your fist is trying to decide whether to eat or be eaten. This is not the story of how mammals won. This is the story of how mammals almost didn't survive at all. Now I know what you're thinking. You came here for space, and I promise, we are going to get genuinely cosmic about this. But here's the thing, this story is about space. Because what happened on this planet 66 million years ago was triggered by a rock from space. A rock traveling at roughly 20 kilometers per second that rewrote the rules of life on Earth in a single afternoon. And what came after that rock? That's the story of how the universe accidentally built us. So stay with me, because in the next 60 minutes, we're going to show you the exact geological window when reptiles nearly took back the Earth. We're going to reveal why the creature that eventually led to you was almost evolutionary roadkill for 20 million years, and we're going to uncover the single climate event that changed everything and reshaped every living thing on this planet. We're going into Earth's most uncertain chapter, and it starts with a broken world. The first thing you need to understand about Earth immediately after the Chicxulub impact is that the word aftermath doesn't come close to covering it. The asteroid itself was approximately 10 kilometers wide when it hit what is now the Yucatan Peninsula. It released energy roughly equivalent to 1 billion Hiroshima bombs. The immediate destruction, the fireball, the mega tsunami, the shockwave was catastrophic on a regional scale. But the global times killing mechanism was what came next. The impact threw enough debris, sulfur compounds, and soot into the upper atmosphere to effectively block sunlight across the entire planet for an estimated 18 months to possibly 3 years. Photosynthesis, the process that underpins almost every food chain on Earth, essentially paused. Imagine turning off the sun. Global temperatures dropped by 15 to 25 degrees Celsius in some regions. The vaporized rock and sulfur dioxide combined with atmospheric water to create sulfuric acid rain that fell across the planet for years. Ocean pH dropped sharply, and the result was an extinction event that eliminated approximately 75% of all species that existed on Earth at the time. Not just the non-avian dinosaurs, everything. Marine reptiles, flying pterosaurs, ammonites, vast portions of the marine food web, enormous numbers of plant species. The extinction didn't surgically remove the dinosaurs and leave everything else intact. It was a shotgun blast to the biosphere. And here is the detail that the triumphalist mammal narrative tends to skip over. Of the roughly 18 known mammal lineages alive immediately before the impact, only 3 major lineages survived into the Paleocene epoch that followed. That's an 83% wipeout of mammal diversity before the so-called Age of Mammals even had a chance to begin. The mammals that did survive were, and I mean this in the most affectionate way possible, pathetic. They were mostly small, nocturnal, insectivorous creatures hiding in underground burrows and root systems. Purgatorius, considered one of the earliest proto-primates and therefore among our most ancient recognizable ancestors, is estimated to have weighed roughly 30 grams. 30 grams. That is lighter than a golf ball. That is lighter than a standard chicken egg. That is who we are rooting for in this story. But here is the counterintuitive part that most people miss entirely. The post-impact world was not a vacuum waiting to be filled by mammals. Because many reptiles survived the extinction event, and not just as minor players huddling in the margins. Crocodilians survived, turtles survived, snakes survived, lizards survived. And in the chaotic, darkened, cold aftermath of the impact, cold-blooded metabolism was temporarily a genuine advantage. Cold-blooded animals require dramatically less food to maintain their bodies. They can go dormant, they can wait. When photosynthesis has essentially stopped and the food web is collapsing, being an animal that can survive on almost nothing is not a weakness, it is a superpower. There's something I find genuinely unsettling about this, like, we celebrate the extinction of the dinosaurs as somehow being good for mammals, but when you actually look at the numbers, it nearly took us with it. If that asteroid had hit just slightly differently, if the impact winter lasted one more year, if the acid rain had persisted just a little longer and collapsed the remaining food chains just a little further, this video probably doesn't exist. None of us do. Okay, let's keep going. So we have a destroyed planet. We have cold-blooded survivors who are already adapted to the chaos. We have a handful of tiny warm-blooded creatures who are absolutely not ready for what comes next. And what comes next is a war that lasted 20 million years. But here's what the textbooks almost never tell you: in the first million years after the dinosaurs disappeared, it wasn't mammals that moved into the empty throne. Something else got there first. The early Paleocene epoch, stretching from 66 to roughly 56 million years ago, is a period that most popular science coverage of the mammal story essentially glosses over. It gets a paragraph, a single slide in a presentation, and then the asteroid hit and mammals took over. But when you actually look at the fossil record from these 10 million years, what you find is not a mammal takeover. What you find is a reptile resurgence. Let's start with the one group that never really left: the crocodilians. Modern crocodiles look nearly identical to their Paleocene ancestors, and that fact tells you something important. When evolution finds a design that works, it tends to leave it alone. In the early Paleocene, crocodilian diversity didn't just hold steady, it exploded. Species diversified rapidly into ecological niches that large dinosaurs had vacated, taking advantage of warming conditions and recovering freshwater ecosystems. Some lineages reached lengths of 8 to 10 meters. These were not background animals. These were apex predators of their ecosystems, and they were expanding. Then there's the snake radiation. Post-extinction, snake diversity underwent what paleontologists describe as a rapid radiation, a burst of evolutionary diversification that filled available niches at remarkable speed. And the crown jewel of this radiation, the species that tends to make everyone's jaw drop when they first encounter it, is Titanoboa ceruginoensis. Titanoboa was formally described in 2009 from fossils discovered in Colombia, and it lived approximately 58 to 60 million years ago, just 6 to 8 million years after the extinction event. It reached 13 meters in length. Its body weight is estimated at around 1,135 kilograms. 13 meters. That's longer than a school bus. Moving through a Paleocene swamp. Hunting. I genuinely don't know how any mammal looked at that and thought, yeah, we're going to be fine. Titanoboa wasn't an anomaly. It was the apex predator of its ecosystem, full stop. And its existence tells us that the warm, recovering world of the early Paleocene was creating conditions where reptiles could grow to sizes we associate with the dinosaurs that had just supposedly been cleared from the stage. Beyond the crocodilians and the giant snakes, there were other reptile groups maintaining significant ecological presence. The Chorostodires, semi-aquatic reptiles that persisted well into the Eocene. Expanding lizard families occupying small body niches, and a general pattern visible in the fossil record from sites like the Nacimiento Formation in New Mexico, where early Paleocene mammal fossils cluster at small body sizes, while sympatric reptile fossils show much larger, more ecologically dominant forms. Here's the critical structural point. The very climate conditions that would eventually favor large mammals first made things better for reptiles. The early Paleocene trended warm. Warm climates enable larger reptile body sizes because ectotherms, cold-blooded animals, require ambient heat to fuel metabolic function at large scales. The warming world was building titanoboa. It was building larger crocodilians. It was feeding the reptile side of this competition at exactly the moment when mammals were still struggling to get above 1 kilogram in body size. Now you might be thinking, if reptiles had all these advantages, why didn't they win? And the answer to that question starts with a geological clock that was already ticking and would eventually detonate. There was a specific, terrifying 4 million year period where the entire mammal lineage came within a razor's edge of being permanently relegated to the ecological margins. Scientists call it the Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum. We call it the near death of everything that came after. The Paleocene epoch is the least celebrated period in the entire mammal story, and that's almost certainly because it's uncomfortable to look at honestly. For 10 million years, from 66 to 56 million years ago, the fossil record tells a story not of triumph but of stasis, struggle, and near failure. Early Paleocene mammals were dominated by a group called Condylarths primitive, generalized creatures that superficially resembled ungulates. In hindsight, they look like evolutionary progress. In the Paleocene, they were small, poorly differentiated, and being outcompeted in most large-body ecological niches. The fossil data shows that mammal species richness, the raw count of how many different mammal species existed at any given time, didn't meaningfully exceed pre-extinction levels until 5 to 7 million years after the impact, the ecological release we expect, the burst of mammal diversification that supposedly followed the clearing of the dinosaurs, simply doesn't happen on schedule. The group that would eventually lead to primates, and therefore to us, had its own internal near-extinction during this period. Plesiodapus and its relatives, the Plesiadapiforms, are sometimes called almost primates. They peaked in the mid-Paleocene, then faced massive competitive pressure from expanding rodent-like groups. Multiple lineages that appeared to be winning in the fossil record at one point simply vanished. No descendants. Evolutionary dead ends scattered across 10 million years of rock. And here's a complication that rarely makes it into popular accounts. Early Paleocene mammals weren't just being pressured by reptiles. The Deccan Traps volcanic complex in what is now India was releasing massive quantities of carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide for potentially hundreds of thousands of years during this same period. The impacts of these eruptions on atmospheric chemistry and global temperatures created what amounts to a double jeopardy for early mammals, dealing with the lingering consequences of impact winter while simultaneously navigating ongoing volcanic climate forcing. There's another competitor that almost no one mentions in this story, and I think it's crucial: multituberculates. These were mammals, but not ancestors of any modern mammal. A completely separate lineage that had actually evolved alongside the dinosaurs and survived the extinction event in reasonable numbers. In terms of species count, multituberculates dominated the Paleocene mammal fauna. They were occupying the small body, seed-eating, and insectivore niches that placental mammals needed to use as a launching pad for diversification. The mammal's biggest threat in the early Paleocene wasn't always a crocodile. Sometimes it was a more successful version of themselves. And I think this is the part of the story that we don't like to tell, because it's uncomfortable. We want the mammal story to be a triumph narrative. Asteroid hits, dinosaurs die, mammals rise. But the reality is that for 10 million years, the outcome was genuinely in doubt. And that's not a caveat to the story. That is the story. Something was about to happen, something completely outside any creature's control that would crack this stalemate wide open. And it would make everything we've talked about look like a warm-up act. Because 55.8 million years ago, The planet's temperature spiked by 5 to 8 degrees Celsius in less than 20,000 years. And somehow this catastrophe turned out to be the single greatest gift mammals ever received. The Paleocene-Eocene thermal maximum, the PETM. If you want to understand why mammals are the dominant large-body animals on Earth today, this is where you start. The scale of this event is worth sitting with. Approximately 3,000 to 9,000 gigatons of carbon were released into the atmosphere over the course of the PETM's onset. For context, humans have released roughly 500 gigatons of carbon since the beginning of industrialization. The source of this carbon release is still debated among scientists. Volcanic activity, the destabilization of methane hydrates on the ocean floor in what's sometimes called the Clathrate gun hypothesis, or most likely a combination of factors operating in feedback with each other. Whatever the trigger, the result was a global temperature spike of 5 to 8 degrees Celsius that persisted for roughly 170,000 to 200,000 years in total. This wasn't a brief anomaly. It was a prolonged pressure cooker that the entire biosphere had to navigate. You know what the striking part is? The PETM released that carbon over tens of thousands of years. We're on a trajectory that could approach comparable carbon totals in a few centuries. I'm not going to tell you what to think about that. I'm just going to let that number sit there for a moment, and then we're going to continue. The conventional assumption would be that extreme heat helps cold-blooded animals and hurts the competition, which should have made the PETM a reptile bonanza. And in some respects, the early phases of the PETM were exactly that. But rapid environmental change operates by different rules than stable warmth. Extreme and fast-moving climate instability disrupts established ecological hierarchies. The species that had built their populations on stable conditions found themselves destabilized. And this is where mammalian biology, with its greater behavioral flexibility, more sophisticated thermoregulation, and more complex social learning, began to show its edge. The fossil evidence from the PETM boundary layers is extraordinary. The record from Wyoming's Bighorn Basin, one of the most studied Paleocene-Eocene transition sequences in the world, shows that within approximately 10,000 years of the PETM's onset, 3 entirely new mammal groups appear in the fossil record simultaneously. The earliest horses, represented by Cypheripus. The earliest true primates, represented by Tailhardina. The earliest artiodactyls, the lineage that would eventually produce deer, cattle, pigs, and whales. These appearances aren't gradual accumulations over millions of years. They're sudden. The PETM cracked something open in mammalian evolution. And then there's Cypheripus itself, which is one of the stranger and more wonderful data points in this entire story. The earliest known horse actually shrank during the peak of the PETM. Its body size dropped from roughly 5.6 kilograms to about 3.9 kilograms, a 30% reduction as temperatures hit their maximum. Then, as the PETM gradually cooled over subsequent tens of thousands of years, Cypheripus's descendants re-expanded in body size. This is one of the most detailed examples of real-time evolutionary response to climate change preserved in the fossil record. An entire evolutionary trajectory visible in the rock, responding to temperature like a thermometer. It's deeply strange. It's also wonderful. The PETM was not without its devastating costs. Deep-sea foraminifera, single-celled organisms that are crucial indicators of ocean health, lost 30 to 50% of their species diversity during this event. Ocean acidification intensified. Terrestrial plant communities were massively disrupted. The planet suffered. But within that suffering, mammalian evolution found its first real foothold. Foothold is not the same as victory, because even as the first horses and primates were appearing, the competition was evolving too. And in the southern hemisphere, on a continent completely sealed off from the rest of the world, reptiles weren't retreating. They were building an empire. And the mammals there were facing something that makes everything we've covered so far look almost gentle. South America spent approximately 30 million years of our story as an island continent, completely isolated from North America by ocean. No land bridge, no exchange of species. What evolved there, evolved alone, in a sealed arena where the rules of competition played out independently of everything happening in Eurasia and North America. And what that isolation produced on the reptile side of the ledger is one of the most underappreciated chapters in paleontology, Sebacus, and the Sebacasusians more broadly. Here is the thing that tends to genuinely stop people when they first hear it. These were crocodilians that walked upright, not the belly-dragging, semi-aquatic ambush predators we picture today. Fully terrestrial, fully upright gated, deep, laterally compressed skulls with serrated teeth remarkably convergent with theropod dinosaur anatomy. Long legs, built for pursuit predation across open ground. Sebacasusians were the apex terrestrial predators of South America for what may have been 45 million years after the extinction event. 45 million years. The mammals of South America evolved under the shadow of land crocodiles for longer than the entire span of time separating us from our most distant primate ancestors. I feel like this doesn't get nearly enough attention. We have been so conditioned to think of crocodiles as swamp animals that when you tell people there were crocodiles running upright across open plains, hunting the ancestors of llamas, people just don't believe it. I understand that reaction. I didn't believe it either when I first read about Sebacus, but it's in the fossil record. It's real, and it changes everything about how we should think about this period. The Sebacasusians weren't operating alone. South America also gave rise to the Phorusrhacids, the terror birds. Giant flightless birds, up to 3 meters tall, with axe-like beaks, capable of delivering concentrated impact force, estimated to have been capable of running at roughly 48 kilometers per hour. Emerging approximately 60 million years ago, terror birds occupied apex predator roles in South American ecosystems for tens of millions of years. They weren't reptiles, but they were filling precisely the predatory ecological space that would have allowed mammalian carnivore evolution to advance, and they were blocking it completely. The isolation experiments of South America and Australia, where marsupials dominated because placental mammals never arrived during the critical window, reveal something essential about the mammal victory narrative. In Australia, Megalania, a giant monitor lizard potentially reaching 7 meters in length, persisted until perhaps 40,000 years ago. The mammals of Australia lived alongside a Komodo dragon scaled up to nightmare proportions for virtually the entire Cenozoic era. The war between mammals and large reptiles did not end at the same time everywhere. It ended at different times on different continents, driven by different combinations of climate, geography, and competitive pressure. The core insight from these isolated evolutionary laboratories is this: mammal dominance was not inevitable. It was contingent on specific conditions aligning in specific places. Change the geography, change the timing of climate events, introduce different competitors, and the outcome shifts. This is not a story about destiny. It is a story about contingency. Now we have the full shape of the battlefield: a warming planet, isolated continents running their own evolutionary experiments, reptiles holding enormous territories across multiple fronts, and mammals slowly, painfully, finding their edges in the northern theaters of Europe, Asia, and North America. But the decisive turning point was approaching, and it arrived not as a triumph, but as another catastrophe. Because apparently, the only way mammals could win this war was for the planet to nearly destroy itself one more time. The Eocene epoch, running from 56 to 34 million years ago, is where the mammal story finally starts to look like progress, but it comes with a trap. A beautiful, warm, lush, false dawn trap that makes the setback at the end even more devastating. The early to middle Eocene represents Earth at its warmest point in the Cenozoic era. Palm trees and subtropical forests grew above the Arctic Circle. Sea surface temperatures near the poles reached approximately 20 degrees Celsius compared to near freezing today. Globally distributed dense forests created habitats where the advantages of mammalian biology, three-dimensional movement through complex canopy environments, social complexity, manipulative appendages, behavioral flexibility translated directly into reproductive success. The first genuine giant mammals emerge in this period. Andrewsarchus, potentially the largest terrestrial mammal carnivore ever to walk the Earth, with a skull measuring roughly 83 centimeters in length. Uintatherium, a rhinoceros-sized creature with multiple bony protuberances on its skull. Early proboscideans, elephant relatives, appear in Africa. For the first time in the story, mammals are competing at the large body ecological tier that had previously been the exclusive territory of dinosaurs and then large reptiles. Something else begins during the Eocene that matters more than body size. Brains get bigger. Encephalization, quotients, the ratio of brain mass to body mass, begin increasing measurably and simultaneously in multiple mammal lineages. Early cetaceans, early primates, early carnivores. This isn't coincidence. The complex, variable, rapidly changing Eocene environment was generating selection pressure for cognitive flexibility. The animals that could solve novel problems, adapt behaviors in response to new situations, and learn from their social groups were surviving better and leaving more descendants. The neural investment that would eventually produce human consciousness begins here, in the warm forests of the Eocene, driven by the competitive pressure of a world that kept changing its rules. And then there's the whale story, which I find endlessly fascinating. Pakicetus, approximately 53 million years ago, was a land-dwelling mammal, roughly the size of a wolf, living near water, occasionally wading in to hunt fish. Within approximately 13 million years, its descendants had completely reinvaded the ocean. By the time of Basilosaurus, roughly 40 million years ago, you have a fully aquatic marine predator up to 20 meters long. Here's the thing about whale evolution that I think about often: those early whale ancestors evolutionarily chose to go back into the water. And when you consider why, the most likely explanation is that the land was still so competitive, so contested, that the ocean, which had been the domain of fish and marine reptiles for hundreds of millions of years, was actually the less dangerous option. That tells you something about how hard the terrestrial world still was, even in the mammal-expanding Eocene. Despite these advances, reptile diversity in the Eocene remained formidable. Gigantophus, a 9 to 10 meter snake from North Africa dating to approximately 37 million years ago, was still competing with large mammals in African ecosystems. Crocodilians maintained dominance in semi-aquatic zones globally. In South America, the Sebicasusians were still holding their ground. The war had shifted in mammals' favor in northern temperate regions, but it was far from concluded. The Eocene came with a hidden trap baked into its warmth: the lush, stable, globally warm conditions that allowed mammal expansion also allowed a particular kind of evolutionary complacency: the development of highly specialized forms perfectly adapted to warm Eocene conditions. When that warmth ended, it ended fast. It ended hard. And it became simultaneously the worst thing that had ever happened to Eocene mammals, and the single event that finally forged their descendants into genuine planetary dominance. 34 million years ago, Earth's temperature dropped by roughly 8 degrees Celsius in what geologists call a geological instant. Antarctica froze for what appears to have been the first time in approximately 34 million years. The great Eocene forests collapsed. Scientists call this the Grand Coupure. I've been saying that phrase in my head for weeks, and I'm still not entirely sure I'm pronouncing it right. French paleontologists, please forgive me, but this is where the war was decided. The Grande Coupure Great Break in French refers to the sudden and dramatic turnover of European mammal faunas at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary approximately 34 million years ago. But the event it reflects was global, and its consequences for the mammal-reptile competition were decisive. Two primary mechanisms drove the climate collapse. First, the opening of the Drake Passage between the southern tip of South America and Antarctica, which created the Antarctic Circumpolar Current, a continuous band of ocean circulation that thermally isolated Antarctica from warmer tropical and temperate waters and triggered rapid glaciation of the continent. Second, a significant decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide that reinforced the cooling trend. The combined effect was a global temperature drop of 4 to 8 degrees Celsius relatively rapidly in geological terms, and the establishment of Antarctica's first permanent ice sheet in tens of millions of years. For the large-body reptiles that had maintained competition with mammals across the Eocene, this cold snap was lethal not universally, not immediately, but systematically and irreversibly in temperate and high-latitude regions. The giant snakes required warm, ambient temperatures to sustain metabolic function at large body sizes. Titanoboa scale snakes were gone by approximately 34 million years ago. Crocodilian diversity contracted sharply outside tropical zones. The thermal floor that had supported large reptile ecological dominance in temperate regions was pulled out from underneath them. And here is the insight that I think reframes this entire story. Endothermy, the ability to generate internal body heat, had been an expensive and, in many respects, competitively disadvantageous trait through the warm Eocene. Warm-blooded animals must eat significantly more than cold-blooded animals of equivalent size to fuel their constant internal temperature regulation. In a warm, stable world with abundant food, that metabolic cost is a competitive liability. For 20 million years of warm Eocene conditions, mammals had been carrying this expensive physiological machinery that was almost a burden. Then the planet changed, and suddenly the metabolic cost that had been a liability for 20 million years became the most valuable adaptation on Earth. Mammals could maintain body temperature in cold environments. They could remain active through cold seasons. They could hunt year-round in regions where reptiles were going dormant or dying. The endothermy that had cost mammals so much for so long finally paid its evolutionary debt with compound interest. The post-Coupure fossil record reflects this transition with striking clarity. In the Oligocene immediately following, spanning from 34 to 23 million years ago, the fossil record shows the explosive diversification of what we recognize as modern mammal orders: Perissodactyla horses and rhinos, Artiodactyla deer, cattle, pigs, carnivora bears, cats, dogs, Proboscidea the elephant lineage. These aren't just more mammals. These are our mammals. Mammals that any naturalist today would recognize as belonging to familiar family trees. They appear in a geological window that, compared to the 10 million years of Paleocene stagnation we tracked earlier, looks almost like an explosion. Mammals didn't win because they were better. They won because they were built for a world that didn't exist yet. For 20 million years, they carried this expensive, high-maintenance, warm-blood system through conditions where it was almost a liability. And then the planet changed. When the climate rewrote the rules, they were the only ones prepared to play by them. The mammals didn't win the war. They outlasted it. Post-Coupure, the Oligocene and early to middle Miocene, spanning 34 to roughly 10 million years ago, represent mammals not just winning but building, constructing entirely new kinds of ecosystems, reshaping the physical landscape of the planet in ways that no reptile group had ever accomplished. The Miocene grassland revolution is the clearest example. Global cooling and drying during the Miocene drove the expansion of grasslands, savannas, steppes, prairies across vast regions of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. Grasses co-evolved with the grazing mammals that ate them, developing silica-based cell structures that wore down teeth, driving the evolution of hypsodont dentition, high-crowned teeth, capable of grinding abrasive grass in horses, bovids, and other grazers. The mammals shaped the landscape as much as the landscape shaped the mammals. Grasslands are, in a meaningful sense, a mammal-created and mammal-dominated ecosystem. No reptile group in the history of the planet had ever restructured entire biomes through co-evolutionary feedback loops with the vegetation. This was something genuinely new. The apex predator transition completes during this period. The emergence of modern carnivore families, Felidae, Canidae, Ursidae, represents the final displacement of reptile-style apex predation from temperate zones. Even before the iconic Smilodon of the Pleistocene, the Oligocene nimravids, false saber-tooths, entirely separate from the true saber-toothed cats, were already filling the top predator niche 30 million years ago. And elephant relatives, the proboscideans, diversified explosively in the Miocene with at least 20 recognized genera, known from fossil sites across Africa, Eurasia, and eventually the Americas. These large-bodied ecosystem engineers modified landscapes in ways that further restructured competitive dynamics against cold-blooded large animals. I find myself wondering sometimes what a Miocene Earth would have looked like to a modern human observer 15 million years ago. Elephants in Europe, giant hyenas in Asia, early apes in African forests. It would have been almost recognizable. Almost. Like looking at a photograph of your grandparents when they were young, you can see yourself in there, but it's also profoundly strange. Reptiles didn't disappear from this world. That's worth being honest about. Modern reptile diversity runs to roughly 10,000 species, which is actually quite high by any measure. Crocodilians persisted in tropical zones. Lizards and snakes maintained and expanded their diversity in small-body niches. What reptiles lost was the large-body terrestrial apex predator role in most regions, a role they had held or contested for the entire 20 million year span of this story. That role, for the first time in Earth's history, now belonged permanently to mammals across every major temperate and tropical terrestrial ecosystem. By the late Miocene, the war is over. But there's one final chapter, the one that brings this all the way back to us. And it starts with a primate in an African forest who was about to do something that no mammal, no reptile, and no creature in 4 billion years of Earth history had ever done before. Winning the war against reptiles was one thing. What one mammal lineage was about to do, reshaping not just an ecosystem but the entire concept of what a living creature could be, that's a completely different kind of victory. And it begins with losing the forest. The great ape lineage that includes humans reached its peak diversity in the mid-Miocene. Over 20 genera of great apes existed approximately 12 to 14 million years ago, spread across Africa and Eurasia. Today there are 4 genera of non-human great apes, plus us. The Miocene-Pliocene transition saw massive ape extinction as forests contracted and grasslands expanded. Our specific lineage, the hominid line, survived this transition, but barely. The branch of the primate tree that led to Homo sapiens was always a minor, vulnerable branch on a tree that was losing most of its branches. When early hominids became bipedal, approximately 6 to 7 million years ago, the mechanical reality is that walking upright on 2 legs was initially inferior to 4-limbed locomotion in several important respects. Early bipeds were slower. They were less stable on broken terrain. The energetic efficiency of early hominin bipedalism was lower than mature human walking. The early hominids were betting on something other than speed. Hands freed from locomotion, the capacity for tool use, social learning that could accumulate and transmit innovations across generations. This is the mammal story's ultimate expression, trading raw physical advantage for cognitive flexibility, doubling down on the neural investment that had been building since the Eocene. And this gamble was made in a genuinely dangerous environment. Early Homo species evolved on savannas that were, with considerable irony, patrolled by the largest concentration of large carnivores in Earth's recent history. Dinofelis, a saber-toothed cat that appears specifically adapted for hunting primates. Homotherium, another saber-toothed predator of wide range. Pachycrocoda, a giant hyena substantially larger than any living hyena species. Lions, leopards. Bone assemblages from sites like Swartkrans in South Africa preserve direct evidence of hominin bones modified by leopard predation. Our ancestors were on the menu, regular prey, not occasional victims, actual prey species, in a landscape where being killed and eaten was a routine occupational hazard. The control of fire, approximately 1 to 1.5 million years ago by Homo erectus, is the single most consequential behavioral innovation in the mammal story, not just because of its direct practical consequences extending the active day, cooking food to extract more calories from the same raw material, providing protection from predators, facilitating complex social gathering around a focal point, but because fire represents something more fundamental. One mammal species had begun to deliberately modify its environment using energy beyond its own metabolic output. The ecological rules that had governed every creature in the preceding 6 million years story were beginning to bend. And then there is the genetic bottleneck evidence, which I find among the most humbling data points in this entire narrative. Genomic analysis, including a major 2023 study, suggests that Homo sapiens passed through an extreme population bottleneck approximately 900,000 years ago, during which the breeding population may have been reduced to fewer than 1,280 individuals. There may have been a second, less severe bottleneck approximately 70,000 years ago, potentially connected to the Toba supervolcanic eruption in Sumatra. The species that would go on to reach 8 billion people was, at multiple points in its history, reduced to a small band of survivors clinging to existence with the same precarity as that 30-gram creature in a burrow 66 million years earlier. I've been sitting with this material for a long time now, and the thing that keeps me up at night, honestly, is not the scale of it. It's the smallness. That tiny animal in the dark, 66 million years ago, hiding in a root system while the world burned above it. That's us. That's where we came from. And I don't know whether that makes me feel small or makes me feel like the most improbable, miraculous accident in the history of this planet. Maybe it's both. Think about the chain of near misses. An asteroid slightly off course, no extinction. Dinosaurs continue. Mammals remain nocturnal insectivores indefinitely. The PETM doesn't happen, no rapid mammal radiation, no first horses, no first primates. The Drake Passage doesn't open, no Antarctic glaciation, no Grande Coupure, no decisive collapse of large reptile dominance. The Miocene apes don't survive the forest contraction, no hominid lineage. The Toba eruption slightly larger, no Homo sapiens. Every step of this 6 million year journey required the right catastrophe at the right time. We are, in the most precise sense of the phrase, children of disaster. Before we close this chapter, I want to reframe something we've been holding on to since the beginning of this journey. We've been telling this story as a war. Mammals versus reptiles. Competitors for ecological dominance across 20 million years of geological time. And that framing was useful. It gave us dramatic stakes, a conflict structure, a rooting interest. But the truth is more nuanced and, I think, more interesting. Every competitive pressure that reptiles placed on early mammals forced something in response. The need to evade large predators drove the development of more sophisticated sensory systems. The competition for food resources drove dietary flexibility and the expansion of brain structures dedicated to problem solving. The need to protect offspring against a world full of larger, more powerful competitors drove the elaboration of parental investment strategies, longer gestation, more intensive care, greater social bonding that are the biological foundation of everything we recognize as human society. Mammalian intelligence, in a very real and measurable sense, is a product of reptile competition. The enemy built us. There's also a deeper biological continuity worth acknowledging: the brainstem structures that regulate basic survival functions in humans. The structures, sometimes colloquially called the reptilian brain trace, directly to shared vertebrate ancestry that predates the mammal-reptile divergence entirely. We didn't defeat reptiles. We shared an ancestor with them, diverged from them, competed with them, and were shaped by that competition into something new. The war was between evolutionary cousins who had inherited different solutions to the same problem of surviving on Earth. The fossil record is still actively rewriting this timeline. Newly described species from Paleocene deposits in Morocco, revised Sebekasusian material from South America, updated dating of early primate fossils. From recent field seasons, the science is alive. The picture is not complete, and that incompleteness is not a weakness of the story. It's an invitation. The core lesson encoded in this 2-0 million year story is not that the strong survive. The survivors weren't the biggest, fastest, or most impressive creatures in their ecosystems. They were the ones who could endure instability, adapt their behavior in response to new pressures, invest in their offspring's survival, and hold on long enough for the conditions to shift in their favor. That principle didn't stop being relevant when mammals won the Cenozoic. It's the same principle that was true for that 3-0-gram animal hiding in the rubble. That animal didn't know it was going to win. It had no access to the arc of the story. It was just trying to survive the night. It did. And here we are. I'll be honest with you, I started building this project thinking it was a story about mammal triumph. It turned out to be a story about survival. About how many times the thing you're rooting for almost didn't make it. I think that's the more honest version, and I believe it's the more useful one. In this space documentary, and yes, I'm calling it that, because the asteroid that started this story came from space, and the cosmic conditions that make this planet livable are what allowed every creature in this story to exist. We stepped into Earth's most uncertain chapter. Not the extinction. What came after? The 2-0 million year struggle that reshaped everything we thought we knew about which creatures are destined to inherit the Earth. The answer, it turns out, is no one. No species is destined for anything. What survives is what holds on long enough for the world to change in its favor. The dinosaurs held on for 165 million years before their luck ran out. The mammals held on for 20 million years of near defeat before theirs finally came in. And us? We have been the dominant large mammal for roughly 300,000 years. In geological terms, we are just getting started. The question is whether we're building something that can outlast the next catastrophe, and whether we've learned anything at all from the ones that made us. Next time, we're going 300 million years further back, before the dinosaurs, before the reptiles, to the creature that started this entire bloodline, the first animal that ever figured out how to breathe air and pull itself onto land. And the world it walked out of makes everything in today's video look like a paradise. If you found yourself genuinely surprised somewhere in this journey, if something in the last hour made the world feel stranger and more fragile and more miraculous than it did before, then you already know why this channel exists. We tell the stories the textbooks bury in the footnotes. That 30-gram animal held on for 66 million years to eventually become someone who could watch a video about it. The least we can do is tell the story right. In the next hour, we're going to show you the exact geological window when reptiles nearly took back the Earth, a moment the textbooks consistently bury in a footnote. We're going to reveal why the creature that eventually led to you was treated as evolutionary roadkill for 20 million years after the extinction that was supposed to set it free. And we're going to uncover the single climate event that changed everything, the one that reshaped every living thing on this planet and accidentally built the conditions for your existence. Now I know what some of you are thinking. You came here for space. And I promise we are going to get cosmic about this. Because here's the thing, this story is about space. The asteroid that started all of it came from space. The cosmic conditions that make this planet livable are precisely what allowed every creature in this story to exist in the first place. So stay with us. This is a space documentary about the strangest, most unlikely survivors in the history of life on Earth. Let's talk about South America, because if there is one theater in this 20 million year war that genuinely deserves its own film, its own dramatic arc, with a cast of characters so strange they seem like they were designed by someone with no respect for biological convention, it is the South American front. After the asteroid impact, South America was an island continent. It had been separated from North America for tens of millions of years, and it would remain isolated for most of the Cenozoic. What that geographic isolation created was something extraordinary, and something that almost ended the mammalian experiment entirely in the Western Hemisphere. It created a closed ecosystem where evolution ran its own parallel experiment, a separate laboratory. And in that laboratory, the rules turned out to be brutally different from what was happening in Europe, Asia, and North Africa. The native South American mammals that emerged from the Paleocene into the Eocene were a remarkable group. We call them the South American ungulates, the notangulates, the litopterns, the astropothers, and they represent one of the great evolutionary radiations in the history of life. These animals filled herbivore niches in ways that parallel what was happening on other continents. But the parallels are uncanny enough to make any evolutionary biologist stop and stare. The litopterns evolved forms that looked, in skeletal structure and limb proportions, extraordinarily similar to horses, and they did this entirely independently, with no shared ancestry with the horses evolving simultaneously in North America and Europe. The notangulates produced forms that convergently resembled rabbits, hippos, and even rhinoceroses. Evolution, working from completely different raw material, kept arriving at the same functional solutions. But here is where South America diverges from the narrative we've been building. Because those herbivores were not competing against recovering reptile lineages for dominance, they were competing against something worse. Something that had found a way to become the apex predator of an entire continent and hold that position for longer than most mammal dynasties last anywhere on Earth. We're talking about the terror birds, the forest racids, and the crocodiliforms that hunted alongside them. The forest racids were not birds in any sense you would find reassuring. They were flightless, between 1 and 3 meters tall depending on the species, with hooked beaks capable of delivering impacts measured in the same force range as modern large felids. They were fast estimates based on leg morphology, suggest sprint speeds competitive with modern large predatory mammals, and they dominated the South American predator guild from the Eocene through most of the Pliocene. That is not a short reign. That is tens of millions of years of a non-mammalian predator holding the apex position on an entire continent, while mammals everywhere else on Earth were consolidating their dominance. Now here is the part that gets genuinely strange, and this is one of those moments in the story where the evidence shifts what you thought you understood. For decades, the standard picture of South America's Cenozoic was essentially this: native mammals as prey, terror birds as predators, occasional crocodiliform ambush predators in the river systems, and the whole system running in relative isolation until the formation of the Isthmus of Panama around 3 million years ago opened the floodgates of the Great American Biotic Interchange. That picture was mostly right, but it was missing something: the Sebecosutians. We touched on them briefly earlier in this journey, but South America is where their story reaches its most unsettling chapter. These were not the sprawling, semi-aquatic crocodilians we associate with modern rivers. Sebecosutians were terrestrial. They had upright limbs. They were fast-moving, cursorial predators, and the South American forms persisted well into the Eocene and possibly beyond. Recent fossil material from Colombia and Argentina has pushed our understanding of their survival timeline significantly later than previously assumed. What that means is that for a substantial portion of the period when mammals were supposedly consolidating their Cenozoic dominance globally, South America had not one but two major lineages of non-mammalian apex predators operating simultaneously: terror birds from the avian dinosaur lineage, terrestrial crocodiliform relatives from the Archosaurian lineage that had produced the dinosaurs themselves, and the mammals of South America, despite the extraordinary diversity of their herbivore fauna, were largely prey. The psychological weight of this, if you let yourself sit with it, is considerable. We tell the story of the Cenozoic as mammalian liberation, and on most of the world's landmasses, that framing holds. But South America, the continent that would eventually produce the evolutionary lineage leading to New World monkeys, and through South American primate ancestors to the entire Platyran branch of our extended primate family, was, for most of the Eocene and Oligocene, a world where mammals had not won anything. They had achieved diversity at the herbivore level while being systematically hunted by predators that answered to no mammalian authority whatsoever. The resolution came, as so many resolutions in this story come, from catastrophe intersecting with geography. The grand coupure we discussed earlier, the climate crash at the Eocene-Oligocene boundary around 34 million years ago, hit South America's isolated ecosystem with particular force. The terror bird lineage contracted. Not eliminated, they would persist and even briefly colonize North America after the isthmus formed, but their diversity and the apparent geographic range of the largest species declined. The terrestrial crocodiliforms appear to have lost ground to cooling temperatures, since their ectothermic physiology was more sensitive to the cooling that accompanied Antarctic glaciation, and into the space those contractions created, South American mammals expanded. Predatory mammals, the Sparassodonts, Metatherian relatives that had been present but not dominant, began filling niches previously occupied by reptile and bird competitors. The South American story matters to the larger narrative for a specific reason that goes beyond its intrinsic drama. It demonstrates that the outcome of the mammal-reptile transition was not globally uniform. It was not a single event or a single threshold moment. It was a series of regional contests, each with its own timeline, each dependent on the specific ecological conditions and evolutionary players present in that particular theater. On some continents, mammals achieved functional dominance relatively quickly after the Paleocene. In South America, the contest ran for tens of millions of years longer. The war had fronts, and not all fronts resolved at the same time. By the time we reach the Oligocene, beginning around 34 million years ago, and running to approximately 23 million years ago and move into the Miocene that followed it, the character of the world has shifted in ways that are hard to overstate. The Eocene, for all its warmth and biological richness, was still a world where the outcome of the mammalian story felt genuinely uncertain in places. The Oligocene changes the tone, not because the struggle ended, but because the margins started to move decisively in one direction. The cooling and drying trend that began with the Grande Coupure continued into the Oligocene. Global temperatures dropped, ice sheets expanded on Antarctica. The shallow seas that had covered large portions of continental Europe during the warm Eocene retreated. Forests contracted, and in the spaces where forests shrank, something new began to expand: open grasslands. This ecological transition from a world dominated by dense tropical and subtropical forest cover to a world with substantial open habitat biomes would prove to be one of the most consequential developments in Cenozoic history, because open grasslands are a fundamentally different competitive environment than closed forest, and the mammals that could exploit them would be shaped by that exploitation into something we would recognize as the ancestors of modern large fauna. The horses are the best illustration of this transformation. Early equids from the Eocene animals like Hyracotherium were small, forest-dwelling browsers with multiple toes, built for moving through dense undergrowth and feeding on soft leaves and fruit. By the Miocene, as grasslands expanded across North America and Eurasia, the horse lineage was producing larger animals, with longer legs built for sustained locomotion across open terrain, with increasingly high-crowned teeth designed to process abrasive grass rather than soft forest browse. The evolution of the horse is the evolution of a mammal lineage responding to a changing world in real time, across millions of years, and becoming more specialized and more successful with every geological epoch. The same story was playing out across multiple lineages simultaneously. The bovids, the lineage that would produce cattle, buffalo, antelope, sheep, and goats, began their explosive radiation in the Miocene, tracking the expansion of grassland habitat with remarkable evolutionary speed. The proboscideans, elephants, and their relatives moved out of Africa during this period and spread across Eurasia in a radiation that placed large-bodied, highly intelligent, socially complex mammals at the apex of terrestrial ecosystems on multiple continents. The carnivorans that preyed on these expanding herbivore communities were themselves diversifying rapidly: felids, canids, ursids, hyenids, all expanding their ranges and refining their predatory strategies in response to prey that was faster, larger, and more behaviorally sophisticated than anything the Eocene predator guilds had faced. And the reptiles? They were still present. They remained ecologically significant. Modern crocodilians, occupying semi-aquatic ambush predator niches with extraordinary efficiency, were by no means marginal players in the ecosystems of the Miocene. Varanid lizards, the lineage that had produced Megalania, the giant monitor of Australia, and that continues today in the form of Komodo dragons, were substantial predators in specific biogeographic regions. Snakes were diversifying and expanding their ranges. The biological richness of the reptile lineages was not erased, but the functional dominance of large, terrestrial warm-blooded mammals in open habitat ecosystems was, by the Miocene, effectively established across most of the world's major landmasses. The war had produced a verdict, not through a single decisive battle, but through the accumulated weight of 20 million years of competition, catastrophe, adaptation, and geographic accident. The Oligocene and Miocene were the period when that verdict became legible in the fossil record, when the trajectory of the story became clear enough that even without knowing what came next, you could read the direction. The mammals had learned, through the hardest possible school, how to build ecosystems, how to fill every available niche at every body size and ecological role, how to survive the instabilities that the climate and the geology of a restless planet kept generating. They were ready for what came next, which brings us to the part of the story that is hardest to tell without feeling the weight of it. Because everything we've been tracking, every near miss, every recovered lineage, every unlikely survivor that held on through a catastrophe it had no right to survive, was building towards something, not intentionally, not with direction or purpose, but with the blind accumulation of consequence that biological history produces. And that accumulation eventually produced a primate. And that primate eventually produced a hominid. And that hominid eventually produced us. The first primates appear in the fossil record in the late Paleocene and early Eocene, roughly 55 to 56 million years ago, possibly slightly earlier depending on which specimens you accept as diagnostic. They were small, arboreal, large-eyed, probably nocturnal in many lineages, shaped by the same competitive pressures that had been molding small mammals for the entire Paleocene. Their defining characteristics, the ones that distinguish primates from other mammals, are almost all legible as adaptations to the same pressures this story has been tracking. Forward-facing eyes providing depth perception, the kind of three-dimensional spatial judgment you need when leaping between branches, or when assessing the precise location of a threat. Grasping hands, the kind of fine motor control that lets you manipulate objects, and that would eventually, in the hominid line, turn manipulation into tool use. Enlarged brains relative to body size, investment in the kind of flexible, learned behavioral responses that competitive and socially complex environments demand. The lineage from those first Eocene primates to the first hominins took approximately 50 million years. The transition from the last common ancestor of chimpanzees and humans to the first members of the genus Homo took another 4 to 5 million years. And the emergence of our own species, Homo sapiens, from the broader Homo lineage occurred roughly 300,000 years ago in Africa. Every step of that journey was shaped by the same forces this story has been about: climate change, competitive pressure, habitat disruption, near extinction, and survival through flexibility and intelligence rather than raw physical dominance. The Toba volcanic eruption approximately 74,000 years ago may have reduced the global human population to a few thousand individuals. Our species has its own near misses written into its genetic record, visible in the bottlenecks that population geneticists can read from modern human DNA. We are not the inevitable outcome of 66 million years of mammalian history. We are one thread, a very recent, very narrow thread in a tapestry that was almost unraveled a dozen times before it produced anything remotely like us. The first primate that climbed into an Eocene forest canopy had no trajectory toward humanity embedded in its biology. It was trying to survive a world that was already 10 million years into the slow process of proving that mammals could hold their own. The mammals that survived the Paleocene crucible, the Peton, the Grande Coupure, the Miocene grassland transition, they passed something forward. No intention, just resilience. Just the accumulated biological inheritance of creatures that had learned, generation by generation, to hold on. That continuity from the 3-0-gram Paleocene survivor in the rubble to the Eocene primate in the forest canopy, to the Miocene ape, watching a world of grass expand to the horizon, to the hominin that first shaped a stone tool with deliberate intent, is the thread that connects everything in this story to you, sitting here watching this. The chain of near misses that runs from the asteroid impact to the present moment includes every ancestor in your lineage. Every single one of them survived something that could have ended the line. Every single one of them was the exception rather than the rule in a world that was statistically indifferent to their survival. And the creature sitting at the end of that chain, the one capable of looking back at the chain and understanding what it means, is perhaps the strangest outcome this 66 million year story could possibly have produced. If that 3-0-gram animal in the rubble had known where the line was going, it probably would have found it unbelievable. So do I, honestly. And I've spent a lot of time thinking about it. The mammal that holds on long enough to become something that can ask where it came from, that's the punchline of a 66 million year joke. The universe has been telling itself, and we are both the audience and the answer. And that joke, it turns out, has one more punchline nobody talks about. Because right now, As you're watching this, the reptiles are still here. The crocodilians that outlasted the non-avian dinosaurs, that watched the mammals stumble through the Paleocene, that survived the Grande Coupure and the Oligocene chill, they are still in the rivers. The snakes that diversified through the Eocene and Miocene are still threading through every ecosystem on the planet. The birds, which are dinosaurs in every technical sense that matters to a paleontologist, outnumber mammal species on Earth today. The war didn't end with a surrender. It ended with a negotiated reality that we walk through every single day without noticing. So here is the thing I want to leave you with. The story of how mammals came to dominate this planet is not a story about superiority. It is a story about timing, catastrophe, climate accident, and the sheer statistical stubbornness of life refusing to be simplified into a single winner. The reptiles taught the mammals everything worth knowing about resilience, and the mammals, in surviving 20 million years of a war they were losing, built the biological foundation for the only creature that has ever looked up at the stars and wondered who else might be out there doing the same thing. We came from the rubble. We almost didn't make it. And if you ever want a reason to find your own existence genuinely staggering, not in a motivational poster way, but in the deep, unsettling, cosmically vertiginous way, just remember that the entire unbroken chain of survival that produced you started with something smaller than your fist, shivering in the dark, 66 million years ago, making a decision that was not really a decision at all, just the next breath, just one more day. That's all it ever was, and somehow, impossibly, it was enough. If the Paleocene survivors had a subscribe button, every single one of them would have hit it, because staying connected to what comes next is literally the only strategy that worked.